So I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon session, which is entitled Science and Democracy. Recent scientific innovations in genomics, nuclear technology, and more recently nanotechnologies are challenging democratic institutions in heterogeneous ways. The need to prevent negative environmental health and social impacts raises questions about how emerging risk technologies should be handled and regulated in democratic societies, and also about if and how lay citizens are able to make decisions about complex scientific issues. At the same time, the role of scientific expertise in policymaking has become more important. However, what is considered legitimate expert knowledge is often debated. Societal controversies have, for example, arisen over antagonistic expert studies in agricultural biotechnology during the past 3 decades. It is the aim of this session on science and democracy to explore these issues and ask questions such as: how should new and potentially risky scientific innovations be governed in democratic societies? And how should democratic institutions and policy processes be designed to meet these challenges? To what extent is and should science be transparent to lay citizens and subject to their decisions? And to ask from a broader perspective, how do science and democracy interdepend, and how is their relationship transformed over time? And last but not least, from a philosophical point of view, what is the standing of democracy at all? I have now the great pleasure to announce the first of our 3 speakers. Herbert Gottweis is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna and a visiting professor at the United Nations University, Tokyo. He is also a research associate at BIOS, the Center for the Study of Bioscience, Biomedicine, Biotechnology and Biosociety at London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Gottweis' research focuses on comparative public policy and central issues in life science governance. He has published widely on these issues. Among his most well-known works is his comparative study on the governance of molecular biology entitled Governing Molecules, the Discursive Politics of Genetic Engineering in Europe and the United States, which was published in MIT Press's Inside Technology series in 1998. Recent publications include an edited volume on the governance of biobanks, published with Routledge, and a collection on the global politics of stem cell research, published by Palgrave, both in 2008. We now look very much forward to his talk, which is entitled Life, Death, and Democracy.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this really interesting conference for inviting me to come to Engelberg. I've never been here before, and it's a very interesting place to visit, and this conference sounds to me very timely and topical, and I myself have worked on the kind of issues which were just mentioned and which seem to be at the core of the interest of this conference, namely issues of science, technology, and how that relates to democracy and governance issues. Today I want to push some of this reflection a little bit further in a slightly different direction and ask a question which I think also fits into this conference, namely what happens when issues of life and death confront democracy, or the other way around, what happens when democracy confronts issues of life and death. This has to do with technology, but not only. And when I talk about life, death, and democracy, I'm thinking, and I will discuss here, topics like human embryonic stem cell research, abortion, but also euthanasia. All topics you're very familiar with here in Switzerland, and you had debates around all these issues, in particular human embryonic stem cell research, euthanasia, is a more recent kind of very interesting debate. I'm not going to talk about Switzerland. I'm a visitor here, so I will draw cases from the United States and from Italy. We've had very interesting discussions around these issues, and based on these cases, I will make some general observations about the relationship between life, death, and democracy, a very, very touchy kind of issues which come very close to ourselves and which, as a result, easily turn into a heated controversy. And I will start with the end-of-life issue, doctor-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and I would like to invite you to move with me for a moment to Italy and into a center of a debate which was going on there until very recently. And can I ask to see a brief video? We have been, yeah. This is about Pier Giorgio Welby, a very famous case of somebody who wanted to die because very sick.
Caro Presidente, scrivo a lei, e attraverso lei mi rivolgo anche a quei cittadini che avranno la possibilità di ascoltare queste mie parole, questo mio grido, che non è di disperazione, ma carico di speranza umana e civile per questo nostro paese. Fino a 2 mesi e mezzo fa la mia vita era sì segnata da difficoltà non indifferenti, ma almeno per qualche ora del giorno potevo, con l'ausilio del mio computer, scrivere, leggere, fare delle ricerche, incontrare gli amici su internet. Ora sono come sprofondato in un baratro da dove non trovo uscita. La giornata inizia con l'allarme del ventilatore polmonare, mentre viene cambiato il filtro umidificatore, e il catheter mount trascorre con il sottofondo della radio, tra frequenti aspirazioni delle secrezioni tracheali, monitoraggio dei parametri ossimetrici, pulizie personali, medicazioni.
Okay, can we stop here? This continues, and what you just saw was a very dramatic intervention in a politics of end-of-life situation. Pier Giorgio Welby, he's suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, and this is basically a disease where gradually the whole bodily system shuts down, and at the end of usually people suffocate. And he had this wish to make an end to his life, and he writes this open letter to the Italian president. He wants to die, and the Italian president invites the parliament to pass a law about end-of-life decisions, especially euthanasia and patient self-determinations. It's the testamento biologico, which was at stake. And then this law is not being passed, and Welby's treating physician, Mario Ricci, disconnects the respirator, and Welby dies, and Ricci is accused of murder, and because he is accused of having helped in voluntary euthanasia, which is strictly forbidden by Italian law. And 2007, Ricci is acquitted by a court. Now, this Welby case sort of gets us right into a larger field of conflicts, controversies, which have to do with the beginning and the end of life. The question which comes in here very much is, what are we as humans allowed to do when it comes to the creation of life? And here the issues of cloning, human embryonic stem cell come in, but also with respect to the determination of life. Again, if you think of cloning, human embryonic stem cell research, this has also to do with the fact that you start life but then stop it and turn life into something you mainly do research about, but you discontinue typically in a human embryonic stem cell research the further development of an embryo. And of course, this debate is not just a sort of a high-tech biomedical type of debate, but also sort of is something we meet at the end of the life, and people are sick and they see they are dying and they are suffering, and they have the wish to terminate their life. And of course, all this is again connected with biomedical research technology, because with modern biomedical technology, of course, you can treat patients in a way that they can continue to live despite the fact that more or less all their bodily functions don't work anymore. But through using technology, modern medicine, you can extend life. And so there is this meeting or this confrontation between people who are about to die but cannot die, and very often these people themselves, like in the Welby case, or the relatives intervening and asking that this life should be terminated. And that leads us to the life and death politics issue in general. Life, death, these are topics which have played a very important role in contemporary social and political theorizing. I just want to mention the names of Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben, two very famous theoreticians who have written extensively about life as a political phenomenon, life which has moved into the center of the attention of power. It's about what seems to be moving very much into the forefront, according to Foucault, is the creation of life, the harnessing of life. And with Agamben, the Italian theoretician, the idea comes in that the right to take life away is something where sovereignty is being constituted. So the whole theoretical debate about life, creating life, terminating life, and its implication going on. And these debates have translated into political cultural discussions in many respects. There's a discussion about culture of life, culture of death. In particular, in the religious context, the Catholic Church has been very important in coining this terminology, and culture of death in the perspective of the Catholic Church links issues like abortion, human embryonic stem cell research, but also in vitro fertilization or euthanasia as something which is becoming more and more important today, and which seems to overwhelm us in some respect. And now what I'm interested in here is to pursue the questions of what happens if these issues come up in the political process, or what doesn't happen. And what some of the thoughts I want to share with you, and what I'm saying here is still sort of work in progress, or thinking in progress. I think one thing, and I will go into details later on, we're observing here is an interesting phenomenon of a new, if you like, to culture of non-decision making. When it comes to these touchy life and death issues, very often political decisions, like passing a law, for example, prohibiting something or not prohibiting something. Very often these decisions are simply not being made. Political scientists like the idea of non-decision making as something very important in the political process, but I think this is something we can see in this area. What we see is also something we see, of course, in a lot of other areas, this phenomenon of the multiplicities of politics. Politics does not take place anymore in particular political institutional settings, like in the parliament, or within political parties, or within media. There are more and more new type of outlets, and this has something to do with virtual politics, like the video I've shown you is from YouTube. Everybody can access YouTube. And increasingly, political actors across all policy areas use these new tools in order to interact in novel ways with audiences which they find out there, not just in their country, but worldwide. What we find in this politics of life and death era also is very often the politics of silence. This is related to the issue of non-decision making. Very often certain things happen, but nobody talks about them, which is also a very interesting phenomenon, because you should think in a democracy, important things which are going on in our societies are visible, are being debated, are being negotiated. We're living in this mass media, sort of media society, and everything seems to be out there, but a lot is not out there. And very often, when it comes to these life and death issues, there is this politics of silence which operates. We see in this area also what I would call a little bit like what we could call the death of the expert. In the old days, experts were everywhere in politics and policy making. They were consulted when there were issues and problems out there. What should we do? Now we are moving into new constellations where all sorts of different actors, stakeholders come up, take a position, engage in a political debate, and become part of controversies. And what we find in this politics of life and death also is the importance of emotions. This is a very emotional policy area, life and death. And it's very interesting. Everybody will immediately, I guess, agree that politics has a lot to do with emotions. If you try to look through the political science literature on emotions, you don't find very much. For some reason, very often social scientists don't tend to be very interested in the question of emotions, despite the fact that they, in general, matter a lot in the field of politics. But we can see that very clearly in these life and death issues, the importance of emotions and our difficulties to deal with emotions in the democratic context. So these are some of the themes I will step by step discuss in my presentation as I'm going through various cases. Now, I mentioned the issue of decision-making, maybe decision-making crisis, which to some extent can be seen as a particular challenge for democracy. What is very typical, not just for life and death issues, but also for issues when it comes to, for example, genetically modified foods and other areas which have to do with life in the broadest sense of the word, that there is no self-evident binding authoritative allocation of values for society as a whole. There is no real center of formally institutionalized state power that we can assume that in these centers, in these political institutional centers, decisions are made which are broadly accepted as sort of speaking for the whole of society. There's also something interesting when we come to these life and death issues, that we are observing intractable policy controversies. These controversies very often are immune to resolution by appeal to facts. This is why experts are in trouble, so to say. Because when it comes to issues like end of life and human embryonic stem cell research, when does life begin, when does it end, the experts are not the main people which are consulted here. And if they are consulted, they are certainly not solving these kind of conflicts. So no a priori unity or implicit notion of the common good can be assumed in this particular area. And it's also not possible to take recourse to any kind of objective truth for knowing what needs to be done in a community. This is what we need, and there is some truth out there we can identify, for example, through the experts. These are not the kind of policy issues where these kind of arguments could come in. And I go back to another euthanasia case in Italy, which shows you how difficult it is to make decisions in these end-of-life issues, and what happens when policymakers, when politicians, when institutions try to take care of these issues. Eleonora Englaro is next to Volpi, a very well-known Italian case of somebody where the end-of-life issue was in the headlines for years and years. And it's in the year 1992 that Englaro has a car accident, has severe brain damage, and it's clear that this brain damage is irreversible. And her father, Giuseppe Englaro, says, well, he knows from his daughter that in earlier situations she has spoken against the idea of life-saving treatments for analogous situations. And in 1999, so quite a number of years later, the father requests from a civil court the right to stop Eluana's artificial nutrition. His request is rejected with the argument that a persistent vegetative state is not equivalent with brain death, and artificial nutrition cannot be defined as medical treatment, but as a nursing which a patient is not allowed to refuse. So that's the legal opinion here. So Giuseppe Englaro doesn't give up. He goes to an appeals court, and this appeals court declares the abandonment of life-saving treatments as legal when the will of the unconscious patient is certifiable and his vegetative state is irreversible. And this continues, and after countless hearings before different courts, the father gets the authorization by a court of appeal in Milano to stop Eluana's artificial nutrition. Eluana is transferred to a nursing home where she is supposed to spend her last days. The artificial nutrition is reduced step by step. And then something interesting happens. The debate moves back into the Italian parliament, and the Italian parliament plans to adopt an emergency decree which should prohibit the termination of artificial nutrition of patients in vegetative state. So this went through all the courts, but there was a political mobilization which then ended up in the parliament that this should not happen. And in the middle of the debate in the Senate, it is being announced that Eleonora Englaro has died, diagnosis cardiac arrest as consequence of renal failure caused by the lack of nutrition. And these are pictures from the Senate, from the Parliament, and there is extreme emotions in the room and agitation and debate. And it shows you what such a topic is doing, what such a case is doing, what kind of repercussions there are on the political level, and how difficult it is to deal with these kind of issues. Of course, when we look at this particular case, a lot of fundamental questions came up. The question of what should be defined as life, for example. Is a person without consciousness still a person? If Eluana was just a being without the abilities to think and feel, would it then make a difference if the machines are turned off or not? Is Eluana still a person? How do we define or redefine life? How should law deal with it? And again, what we see here is the father of Eluana, the relatives, very often they play, of course, an important role in these situations. He doesn't just say this is the law. He moves out. He moves into the public. He engages. He goes to the courts. It becomes a large political issue, something like a bottom-up movement, and the Walby case and some other cases they could give you just stand for that. This kind of bottom-up mobilization which happens occasionally within the political institutions as we know them, but very often outside. New tools are used, like, for example, YouTube, TV, video clips, all sorts of other unconventional forms of mobilization. And now I move to the other sort of end of the story, the debate on human embryonic stem cells in the United States. That has nothing to do at the first glance with ending life, but actually it has. And of course it has a lot to do with modern medicine, modern biomedicine. And as you know, in 1997, Dolly the sheep, the first cloned sheep, was born. And cloning was possible before, but not with mammals. And when Dolly arrived on the scene, it was clear that the technology which was used to clone Dolly could in principle be also used to clone humans. It never happened until now. Never happened. It's too difficult to do it. In humans it looks much easier apparently with animals like dogs, cats, sheep. But there was immediately a very, very strong mobilization in United States politics. Senators started to introduce anti-cloning bills, making sure that no federal funds can be used to finance cloning. We see in the years to come an extreme polarization in this field in the United States. And this extreme polarization also has to do with a crisis in the anti-choice or the movement critical of abortion. Abortion has been a long topic, a long-lasting topic in the United States politics. It is still a very big topic. But in the mid-1990s, there was a real crisis in the abortion debate, some sort of an escalation. There were assassinations of doctors in clinics in Florida, in Massachusetts, in Canada. Militia movements and the far right started to define the battle against abortion. This radicalization was seen by some people critical of abortion as something that didn't want to continue, and as a result, a number of the religious groups that were opposed to abortion started to look for other topics to link up the abortion issue and human embryonic stem cell research. Cloning were the kind of issues which came in, and around this time a paper, Encyclica, came out which started to bring in the idea of this culture of death versus the culture of life. And that has led to a polarization which is going on until today, and it's a battle over funding human embryonic stem cell research in the United States. And the interesting thing is, you can do everything when it comes to cloning humans, human embryonic stem cell research in the United States, as long as you don't do it with public money. If you want federal money, tight restrictions are being imposed. And this, of course, is a key area if you get National Institute of Health, NIH funding or not. And a lot of political conflicts on the level of state contests, even presidential elections, were very often taking up the issue of human embryonic stem cell research and the question, should it be funded or not? And can I see the next film clip now?
As you might know, I care deeply about stem cell research. In Missouri, you can elect Claire McCaskill, who shares my hope for cures. Unfortunately, Senator Jim Talent opposes expanding stem cell research. Senator Talent even wanted to criminalize the science that gives us a chance for hope. They say all politics is local, but it's not always the case. What you do in Missouri matters to millions of Americans. Americans like me.
Okay, and what you see here is Michael J. Fox, whom you know, a famous Hollywood actor, who has Parkinson's disease. In the middle of the human embryonic stem cell debate, there are midterm elections. It's about a congressional seat in Missouri. And Michael J. Fox sort of jumps into the arena and talks to the viewers of this video. This was aired on TV. And says, well, there are two candidates for this seat in Missouri. One, this woman, McCaskill, and then the opponent, who was the incumbent, is against human embryonic stem cell research, and the challenger, Senator McCaskill, is supportive of it. And he says, well, support McCaskill because she is supportive of human embryonic stem cell research. Now, this in itself wouldn't be so interesting. What's interesting about this video, which until now has been seen worldwide by millions of people, is that this was one of the first situations where a Parkinson patient goes out into a very broad public, a very well-known Parkinson patient, and demonstrates to some extent what it means to have late-stage Parkinson, because this is what the case with Michael J. Fox. He's at a very late stage of Parkinson, where dyskinesia comes in after long drug treatment, which means that he is moving and shaking. And this is one way how you can be when you have Parkinson at that late stage. The other stage is that you are freezing, which means you cannot do anything. It's these two kind of states you're balancing usually back and forth. And of course, everybody knows what Parkinson is, but who has seen a Parkinson patient in that sort of situation? And this, of course, was a video which was, in many respects, something very moving, because he really, Michael J. Fox, in this video sort of communicated through his talk, through his presence, what it means to be sick. And he was speaking to the voters. He was speaking, of course, to the emotions of the voter, to vote for this senator who is in support of stem cell research. And what you find here on this slide is just very recently, in the latest twist of this whole debate, stem cell research again was banned by the federal court in the United States, arguing that this is illegal in the context of American legislation. And this battle continues until now and has been going on already ever since human embryonic stem cells arrived on the political scene in the United States. What we see here, and again, I make some more general statements, is in this, and I mentioned it before, in this field of life, death, we see the new importance of emotional language. The intimate becomes political. Michael J. Fox, he displays an individual condition. His suffering is supposed to speak to us, and the development of the disease is not concealed. He shows it, he demonstrates it. And then if you look, for example, at comments on YouTube, people were commenting on this video. People are saying, well, this literally made my mouth drop. Powerful ad. Michael, we love you. This is heavy duty dog. It sort of goes back and forth. What is he doing here? What has he done? Why has he done this video? What was he showing? What is it about? And that shows how you engage in this kind of presentation. Many people out there who start thinking about what it means to have Parkinson, what it causes, and what might be done about it. And I think on a more theoretical level, that shows us when we talk about the political process, it's not just logos, the experts, which dominate, but decision-making, convincing, persuasion in democracy has also a lot to do with pathos and with ethos, with trust, respect, authority, but also empathy, sympathy, anger, fear. Very often our notion of politics is a narrow one, because in a historical tradition we say, let's keep emotions out. Emotions has nothing to do with a sound kind of democratic process. But I would argue this is not the case. And there's a whole theoretical, philosophical tradition which also argues along these lines, starting with David Hume and much earlier with Aristotle, who have seen the importance of emotions in the political process in making good judgments, which of course is very much something we all have in mind when we think about democracy and how democracy should be organized. There is this virtualization of politics, which plays here a very important role, this new type of cyberspace which is unfolding and which allows for a lot of experimentations and new modes of communication in all policy areas, but certainly in this life and politics field. I've mentioned before, when we look at these issues, what we see is not just non-decision making, emotions, but also this silence, invisibility. There's this suspicious silence, if you like to, in a lot of these life and death issues. Ethically sensible issues are very often abandoned in a legal vacuum. Decisions by regulators or lawmakers are not being made. But a lot of things are going on. In Italy, one talks about euthanasia clandestina, which means euthanasia is forbidden in Italy. But everybody knows that many hospitals in Italy are practicing euthanasia. It's not legal, but it's actually operating. If we jump to the embryo research area in the United States, there is something like a politics of non-fetus research in the United States. From a legal point of view, you can, for example, do research with fetuses. But de facto, everybody in the research community stays away from this kind of research because everybody feels it's so sensitive, we should not even think about it and certainly not practice this in research because it's such a touchy issue. And if we come to a topic like abortion, for example, well, of course, abortion is legal in the United States. But in most states of the United States, there are very stringent restrictions on the practice of abortion. This is not very broadly in the debate. Everybody knows it is very difficult to get an abortion in many, many states in the United States, but it's still nevertheless the case. Now, let me come to some conclusions on this life, death, and democracy issue. And a lot of the things I have discussed here are not just applying for life and death issues, but overall have relevance to many other policy areas. But I think if we look at these life and death issues, we see something more specific, more nuanced, which maybe means a crystallization of developments which we might not see so clearly in other areas. But there's also something very specific, how we deal with life and death in democracy. I mentioned we are observing these kind of controversies today in a situation where the political process is multiple, networked, virtual. The classical institutions, political institutions like the parliaments, still are important, but they're certainly not the only spaces or places where this type of life and death politics happens. Think of the Web 2.0, think of the internet and all these kind of new technologies which create completely new virtual spaces for political calculation. There is this issue that we are, and this is very specific for life and death issues, of course, these intractable controversies. These are controversies which cannot be solved by appeal to facts. There doesn't seem to be a space for solving them. Simultaneously, traditional interest groups, political parties, lobbies, somehow seem to lose of importance in this game. They're still there, but they are actors next to other actors. Very often, as I was pointing out, these issues of life and death are not being decided. They are sort of submerged. There is a politics of silence. And there is, of course, also a politics of repressed emotions. Fear, anxiety, contempt, pity, shame very often operate submerged without being argued in political institutions. And I mentioned that before. There is this whole theoretical, philosophical idea that emotions are bad in politics. Let's get rid of the emotions. People do exercises, for example, in citizen deliberations where they admit everything. You can put all the arguments on the table, but not your emotions. And of course, this means cutting off a process of reflection and a process of argumentation. These flows of communications, as I have described them, take new forms today, blog spheres, YouTube, etc. They're not so easily controlled as in the past, like in the form of the parliament or in a well-defined citizen conference, for example, because citizen conferences are everywhere today. They are called Facebook, for example, or something else. And we see, in fact, new communities emerge, like for example, end-of-life communities. It's a huge community out there in the world which is very well organized in the net and tries to exert political pressure on the decision-making process. And simultaneously, as I said, the modernist institutions, as we know them, are very often hesitant to make decisions. The classical kind of conflicts, which we have often seen in these technology and democracy conflicts, like modernization critics versus technocratic elites, the defenders of the new technologies, are not that relevant anymore, and certainly not in this field. Common interest has not disappeared in this what's sometimes called Republic 2.0, but it's more difficult to generate and to symbolize, in particular when it comes to large countries like the United States. There's this new politics of intimacy, and I would argue that emotional display and expression might today, in these areas in particular, be at least as important as channeling preferences, as it is being traditionally done, for example, in interest politics. Modes and ritual of authenticity gain of importance. The public participation and consultation is, of course, something important, but at the same time, we have to see that things are moving on. It's not just about bringing in publics, doing consultations, but creating spaces for these new developments I've been trying to describe. We also see that voices of authority and expertise have disappeared to a considerable extent in these political fields. Who speaks with authority? This should happen, this should not happen, and this being followed. And this leads me to some questions I want to throw at you. thinking all these issues together, I have been sketching during the last 35 minutes. The question is, I think one important question is, in the democratic context, how is authoritative policymaking, decision-making possible in late modernity? I'm not talking about authoritarian policymaking, but authoritative policymaking. Policymaking with decisions which are being followed. Of course, a very important issue is how can trust for this politics of life and death be generated, taking into account how everything is dispersed, a little bit anarchic, uncontrollable. And I think another very important issue is how and where to argue emotions. Emotions are not just something which come out of people, which are just there, but emotions are coming into a political debate and then are being argued. People say, well, I don't understand why you have these feelings. And somebody else says, well, I disagree with this reaction. How are we dealing with these kind of processes in the democratic political context? I think we do not have good solutions for that at this stage. And a very important issue related to the issue of repressing emotions is what can be done in this field of politics of life and death to move the submerged, the silenced, all these kind of issues where everybody knows they exist, but nobody talks about. How can we move these issues into the open realm of civic debate and public decision makings? These are some questions which I think can be raised towards the end of this presentation, and I hope maybe you have some thoughts or answers to these questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much, Herbert Gottweis, for this inspiring talk, and then positive questions. Questions are also just thoughts or comments on the talk. Well, if not, I will allow myself to ask a question. Just this very last question you raised, which I think is very important. Do you have yourself any thoughts about how policy processes or also political institutions may be shaped to sort of include these silenced voices and what is suppressed? Do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, I have to admit I don't have sort of any ready-made solutions for this particular problem. So my idea was more to point to the fact that there is something out there, issues which raise a lot of emotions, and we actually, in our typical type of democratic situation, we are living in a situation where emotions somehow don't seem to fit in or are systematically excluded. That, of course, has, for example, the impact that they very often sort of break out. You know, if you repress something, if something is submerged, it's always there. This was, for example, I think quite visible in the Italian euthanasia case, where these issues sort of periodically erupted. I think one issue, for example, or one area where one could, one strategy one could think about would be to rethink the kind of consultation, citizen type of conferences which have been so much in fashion over the last 25 years, and to think about new formats which systematically are not just focusing on argument against arguments, the confrontation of different arguments, but also create a space where people can bring in, for example, anxieties, and where these kind of articulations and concerns are being taken seriously and not eliminated up front as something which would not fit into this type of deliberation. So these kind of experiments are going on, but I think the Another question, of course, is what would that mean, for example, for the political institutions as we know them? As I'm saying, I don't have sort of any clear-cut solutions, but one could think of experimentation in the field of participatory forms of governance and bring in more these forms.
Yes, please.
You described silencing as a kind of pathological development, but it may in fact be a very prudent solution to how to deal with conflicts that cannot be resolved. I mean, you have irreconcilable value conflicts, and so it is very prudent to silence them somehow. And then you will see what happens. For instance, in Germany, euthanasia is not openly discussed. If it ever is discussed, it's shut down by the elites, not by the population. The population agrees with euthanasia. But what happens is the courts silently accept euthanasia in very extreme cases. And so you get away with this conflict without putting it on the agenda. Because if you put it on the agenda, you will have a real bitter conflict. So silencing may be a good solution.
Yeah, I guess that's probably one take on it, that one shouldn't let these things come out too much into the open. It's also in the euthanasia field, people who are supportive of the idea of doctor-assisted suicide, we maybe shouldn't have much of a discussion about it, because if you have too much of a discussion, or if you have a law, for example, these things would not be going on submerged in the different clinics. It's sort of a matter of balancing different arguments against each other. I do have the feeling that repressing emotions over the long time is not a healthy process, and I guess most psychologists would agree with me with that. If you have concerns, anxieties, fears, and you repress them, very often this leads to psychological illness, to whatever it is, depression or this or that. And so my hunch would be that that it might make sense to let these things come out and to think about ways how to do that. Because I think one issue is also that, of course, living in democracy, we want to think about more systematic procedures, for example, or ways of dealing with these emotions and acknowledging them. And very often it's only a matter of acknowledging something. It's not even a matter of coming up with a solution. But if you acknowledge that people, for example, find embryo research something shocking, for example, if this is legitimate, this might be already sort of a part of a policy process, a very important part of a process, where you then can end up with a form of policy compromise or a policy negotiation. But of course, what you're saying is very valid. Maybe there is something about silencing. My feeling is, looking at the whole field, that there's too much of that building up, which then leads to what one could call unhealthy developments. And I think, for example, the United States is a very interesting example for that, where a lot is repressed and where these battlefields are across society and increasingly make American society so divided. There are many reasons why American society is as divided as it is, but these culture of life versus culture of death issues are a very, very important moment in this divisiveness of U.S. political culture today. But nobody knows the truth of what would be the better strategy. I agree with you.
Yes, please, in the back.
Is it on? I'm not so sure whether emotions are so much, or maybe I got something wrong, but I got the impression you're emphasizing so much that emotions are suppressed around these topics. Now, my impression is actually rather the opposite. So could you elaborate a bit more why you think emotions are so much suppressed when it comes to these issues? I mean, some people would argue we do have a lot of emotionalization, not only around these issues, around almost any political issues right now, and perhaps we even have a bit too much emotionalization. It can also be on things like national identity and things like that, globalization, what have you. I mean, a lot of these emotions also we saw going back to the nuclear power plant controversy we had in the 80s, which also was a rational argument versus rational argument, which ended in a deadlock, basically. So could you elaborate a bit further why you think emotions are so much suppressed on these issues?
Yeah, of course I understand what you're saying. We could say, well, aren't emotions everywhere? You know, people are fighting against each other in politics and shouting against each other and accusing each other. And of course, this definitely is the case. But what I've been trying to argue was that we do have this tendency, when this happens, to say it's bad. We should, and this is actually a whole line of reasoning in political philosophy, starting with Plato, from Kant over Hegel until today, political and contemporary political philosophy. Emotions are something which need to be eliminated in the political process. As something inherently evil. You can sort of write whole books about it, and actually people have written about that. And so they are sort of a distortion. And now my argument would be we should find ways of dealing constructively with the existence of emotions. Meaning that we need spaces where emotions can be articulated, where they legitimately can be articulated, where they can be brought out, where the different emotions, anger, hope, anxiety, whatever, can meet. And where emotions become part of the process of political judgment. I mean, this is what I have in mind here. If you think about what is democracy? Democracy has to do with political judgment. How do we make the right kind of decisions? And I would now argue it's not just about balancing A against B. This would be logos. But there is also a very important argument of the emotions, feelings people have about all sorts of things in different directions. And this needs to be brought in more systematically in making the process of political judgment sort of more comprehensive, richer, deeper. So, I mean, it's a difficult issue. I completely agree with you. The emotions seem to be everywhere. But what I'm trying to say, they are everywhere. They are very often seen as a distortion, something from where we have to move away. And I'm saying we should embrace the idea that politics is emotional and find ways of sort of, if you like, to cultivate these emotions, bring them in into the process of political judgment and political decision making. I'm not sure if this answer satisfies you, but you're pointing exactly to the right kind of issue. What about this? It's everywhere, and at the same time, I'm arguing, well, we should have more of that. I don't mean we should have more sort of shouting duels and people aggressively attacking each other. I'm talking about ways to bring in emotions to improve and to enrich political judgment.
There was one question there.
Thank you very much. I would like to make a point about the questions you've raised about bringing the submerged and silence into the open realm of the civic debate. And in my opinion, one very good solution would be to give the people more direct democratic instruments to express their opinion. Because take, for example, the discussion about euthanasia in Switzerland. The government has made a quite restrictive proposition about dealing with euthanasia, and during the so-called Vernehmlassungsverfahren, I don't know the word in English, excuse me, they had to realize that the people actually don't think quite the same about this topic. They now have to evaluate all the feedback that has come. And in my opinion, if people have the possibility to express their opinion, if they have the possibility to put pressure on the legislative, on the executive, they won't be able to suppress the emotions and these submerged topics in politics. And another excellent instrument is the initiative, which gives the people the possibility to set the agenda, to bring topics on the agenda of the politics which the elite probably wouldn't deal with because it's a too hot topic, and therefore I would vote for more direct democratic instruments also in other countries, not only in Switzerland.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to a very important aspect of the politics of emotions, that yes, it can be the responsibility of those who are elected, of the governments, of the policymakers, to allow for the articulation of emotions. My favorite example is the human embryonic stem cell debate in the United Kingdom. There's no country which has such liberal regulation when it comes to human embryonic stem cell and cloning as the UK. It's really extremely liberal. Almost everything is allowed, even to create chimeras, sort of mixture between humans and animals. And a very interesting question is, why do the UK have this extremely open liberal legislation in this field? Why was there not such an uproar against all these kind of things people usually are quite offended by, like cloning humans, for example? And if you look closer at the policymaking process there, you see a great deal of openness, a great deal of effort to bring in all sorts of voices and articulations of concerns, of hope, of patients, of doctors, of religious groups. And in this particular situation, the government made a very deliberate effort to create, probably not on purpose, but de facto, to create a space where the different feelings could be articulated. And I think when you think about embryo research, for example, think about this particular case. Doing research with very early embryos, for example. You can easily imagine that a lot of people say, well, this is strange. I have very bad feeling about it. But if you sort of go through the process, and very often that is sort of a typical process, if you have a strange feeling about something, if you go through your emotions, it doesn't really mean that you end up rejecting all of that. You have found out how you feel about that, and that might be a step for you to deal with an issue like what to do with human embryo research and disease and all these people who have all these terrible diseases. How could they be helped? Maybe people had to go through their emotions in order to be supportive of this type of research. And in this particular case, it was very clear that the government very much tried to open up the space and to bring in these different voices, not just in terms of rational argument, because there was not much rationality here. Should we do that or not? Should this research happen or not? Experts didn't play such a huge role here. It was more about how do you feel about that? And this debate, this confrontation was possible in particular in the UK.